So where I wanted to start was with this scripture. I think this is where everything lands in what our work is today, but also ongoing. Can we read this together? Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. And that's Matthew 28:19 and 20. And friends, this is why every church in this room exists. Every church. This is our purpose. This is why you continue to be anointed to be open. And everything that we do should be measured and pointing towards our purpose. So let's take a look at another reason that maybe we should be thinking about making disciples. If you'll remember, as part of our mission of the United Methodist Church is the making of new disciples. I took a little bit of authority there and added new. The making of new disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Why do you think I would want to use the word new? We're not into stealing sheep. No pin jumping. That's not our purpose, right? But somehow we sometimes get stuck to say, as long as I'm doing my own thing, as long as I'm studying the Word, aren't I growing in my discipleship? Well, if we are growing in our discipleship, mature disciples disciple others. And sometimes we get stuck in the discipling ourselves, and we miss our true purpose of spreading the good news. So friends, no matter how you structure your church, just make sure that you are pointing to this purpose. And this is where the accountable leadership model comes in, because we are constantly asking the question, how is this aligning with our purpose? How are we doing at making disciples? How are we doing it the very reason in which we exist? But you see, when we manage our church as the board, instead of govern, we're not asking that question. Because we get so tied up in the day-to-day operation that no one is standing on the balcony asking the really important questions of the why and the alignment. So I love this. This is on winning on purpose. This is a book that I highly recommend, Winning on Purpose. It's by John Edmund, Edmund, Kaiser, Kaiser. He is the author of Winning on Purpose. Now, y'all, he's not a United Methodist. He's a Baptist. So get the essence of, all right? But then that's why Mission Possible is the companion to this. John Edmund Kaiser wrote the foreword to Mission Possible. And so think of this as theory and the understanding. Think of Mission Possible as the nuts and bolts, how to apply. In the foreword of this book, Tom Bandy, who is seen kind of as a church guru, many of you have heard from him, wrote this about what it really means to be an accountable church. So let's read this together as well. Do you want the mission to succeed? Are you prepared to stake everything, change anything, and do whatever it takes, even if it means altering long familiar habits, redeveloping precious programs, and redeploying sacred assets? Wow. This is what accountable leadership looks like. That we are really willing to make the hard decisions if we really want the mission of making disciples to succeed. So we're really ready to stake everything, change anything, and do whatever it takes, even if it means altering long, familiar habits, redeploying precious programs, and redeploying sacred assets. You see, when we're willing to hold one another accountable and we put the mission and purpose of the church at the beginning, at the focus, as the priority, as our go-to, everything will change. The questions change, and therefore the answers will change as well. So when we think about church leadership as it relates to leadership and the structures in which some of our typical churches, we basically have kind of 5 different ways that we could model leadership. Bureaucratic is large church, large group driven. So there's a group of people who make all the decisions based on mostly personal preference and their own ideas. Autocratic is driven by one particular person. Committee-based or consensus-driven. So we got to get everybody on board. We got to have peace in the valley over anything else. Pastor-centered or personality-driven. So if we ever see a church that's climb in worship attendance, and we have a pastor leave and we go, and we fall off the cliff, that means that we have a pastor-centered or personality-driven church, or at least for that season. And then the preferable way is accountable leadership model. So let's break these down a little bit more. When we have bureaucratic-led leadership, the pastor is expected to accomplish the mission, but we don't really give him or her any power to do so. So in this particular model, we give him responsibility, but no authority. So that's pretty safe, but it's not very effective in our mission. If we look at the autocratic model, one person is expected to accomplish the mission, has been given the power to do so, but there are no consequences for not fulfilling the purpose or producing fruit. So we've given responsibility, we've given the authority, but we don't hold them accountable. So that's pretty effective, but it's not necessarily very safe. Now, when we look at committee-based or consensus-driven kind of leadership, as we've demonstrated this morning, decisions are sometimes quite slow. That is, if they happen at all, right? Sometimes we just give up because we can't fight our way through the system to get a decision made. So decisions, since consensus is the goal, are never focused on the mission. It's making everybody happy. And it's about compromise. And so when we compromise, really no one is happy. It becomes better to maintain the relationships with one another than it is about fulfilling the mission. Also in committee-based or consensus-driven leadership, there is no one person that can be held accountable. How do you hold a committee responsible? It's impossible. Now, if there's a chair and you hold the chair accountable, now we're talking. The role of the pastor and the staff as leaders is limited in the committee-based structure, and the pastor and the staff are evaluated by the congregation, and the power resides with the person or group who does the evaluation. So it's about, think about this, if the congregation is evaluating the pastor, then it is, how has the pastor treated me personally? Or what's my personal relationship with the pastor? As opposed to, how well is the pastor doing in leading us and being a missionally focused church of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world? It's a very different focus. When we have pastor-centered or personality-driven leadership, the pastor makes all the major decisions. Everything revolves around and is dependent on the pastor. I went into a church after the pastor had literally died at his desk. And you see what happened is the pastor had the only password. The pastor was the only one that had the alarm code. Everything was pastor-centered, and it took us a year to unravel and get access to everything. In a pastor-centered or personality-driven leadership, decisions are made quickly and sometimes impulsively, or those knee-jerk kind of decisions. And sometimes, perhaps, they're even unrealistic. Also, in a pastor-centered or personality-driven leadership, dissent is not tolerated. Everybody line up. The pastor spends his or her time just putting out the fires. That's that urgent stuff that's walking in the door. You're managing the fires every day. Laity leaders are evaluated by the pastor and the staff, and the congregation feels quite run over and disconnected from the ministries and the mission of the church. There's just no alignment. However, when we do accountable leadership, we have responsibility, we have authority, and we have accountability. All three of those things are woven together that gives us a safe and effective ministry setting. Let's break down those three terms a little bit more. Responsibility. When you give someone responsibility, you are giving them a duty or an obligation to satisfactorily perform or complete a task by one person. One person is clearly given a task to do, clearly defined. When you give someone the authority, you're giving them the power or the direction to make decisions. Give them full authority. Then the accountability piece is for the person that is to hold someone accountable, and also the person being held accountable is an obligation or a willingness to accept responsibility or to account for one's actions. What a wonderful place it would be, right, if we could be practicing this kind of leadership. It is safe and it is effective. When we get to mission-driven, accountable leadership, those responsible are held accountable. The mission of the church comes first. The mission of the church comes first. We must have the right people in place to accomplish the mission. So that means we have to hold people accountable to the authority and responsibility of the roles we've put them in. And if they're unable to fulfill, we have to be brave and courageous enough to move them on. With grace and love, but we need to be willing to help them find a place that they are spiritually gifted for, not in a place that is holding the church back. We have a small number of decision makers, but a large number of people in ministry. Do you see it flips around? Think of that church I was talking about that worshiped 100. So instead of having 132 slots of administration, we now had a dozen, which left 88 people to do ministry. That church's whole focus changed when they were able to flip that around. In this model, shepherding is done by the laity, not by the pastor. Now, let me put an asterisk here. The smaller the church is, the more the pastor is going to be the one who is doing more of the pastoral care. Okay? That's just the family dynamics of smaller churches. The larger the church, the more the pastor is not doing congregational care. All right? Now, what we need to get away from is that regardless of what size you are, that the pastor does it all. Okay? Some people's spiritual gifts as laity is caring for other people. By the pastor doing all of the care, and even expected to do all the care by sometimes our laity, our congregation, we're keeping people from using their giftedness. And we're keeping the pastor focused inwardly to our own people, which allows no time to be concentrating and living in the mission field to reach new people. Now, to say that we're going to go back and just say, all right, well, 2 or 3 people are going to start doing congregational care, it doesn't work that way. There has to be training, equipping, communicating around how this works. So if you need to shift this model, just make sure that you do it with intentionality and training. Don't just flip the switch. All right. Also with accountable, mission-driven leadership, there is lots of input. Remember, town hall meetings, communication, but we have a very, very focused direction, right? Very focused. The pastor in this model evaluates staff. Now, I know some of you have already said, well, I don't have any staff. Yeah, you do. They just happen to be unpaid. Everyone is held accountable for the mission. All the way up and down, everyone is held accountable for the mission. What are you doing specifically to be in alignment of making disciples? Alignment to the mission and vision is critical, and it isn't about consensus, because I'll tell you, you're never going to get consensus about that alignment for many years if you're not there now. That's a change in DNA and a change in culture to get there. All right, I'm going to give you a few minutes here. We're going to set the timer for 5 minutes this time. What is driving your church? What kind of leadership are you currently using as your model? Is it autocratic? Is it bureaucratic? Is it committee-driven? Or are you practicing accountable leadership? So spend just a few minutes and identify what is the current leadership model that you're using.